So, dear colleagues, dear students, it's my great pleasure to open our today's lecture, which is being prepared, which has been prepared in collaboration with Saurashtra University, Rajkot, India. We are very happy to have with us today Professor Kamal Mehta, who is an experienced teacher, professor of English in the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies at Saurashtra University, who has been teaching for the last 38 years. So it's a lot of experience with students and English literature. He has taught linguistics, Indian literature in English translation, Indian poetics, British literature, African literature, and Caribbean literature in the past. So it's really wide variety of topics. And at present, he teaches comparative literature and translation studies. He is an author of many books and many papers and literary translations. We were very happy to have him here at the university. When was it? A year ago or 2 years ago? So we had the unique chance to meet the professor in person. So we are very happy to be with him, to see him again. And we are very much looking forward to his today's presentation, which will be very interesting and very useful for us, because he's going to talk about the literary form of novel in Indian English literature. Professor, the stage is yours. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. I begin with my sincere thanks to Constantine the Philosopher University, Nitra, Slovakia, and in particular its Department of English and its entire staff, especially Dr. Maria Rikova, for making this possible today to have an interaction with the esteemed students of our department, as well as our students on our side. As it has been announced, I'm going to speak on the Indian novel in English. And what I would provide in my talk would be a kind of bird's eye view of the journey of novel in Indian English. All of us know, and this is an established fact, at least among the students and critics of literature in India, that novel is not an Indian literary form. It has been accepted that novel is primarily a European, or rather the English literary form. And it could emerge, and it has emerged very powerfully now, but it could emerge just because there was a kind of encounter between the East and the West due to colonial period. In the 18th century onwards, when the Britishers and some other European powers ruled over different parts of India, then we came in contact with their literatures, which also included novel. And primarily, English was the major language, major literature, because it occupied larger portion of the country. And so English became a part and parcel of education as well. And so our young minds came in contact with English literature and English novels also, and that led them to create literature in the literary form called novel. Should I? Yeah. However, I must say that there is no doubt a very small number of people, but they strongly believe that the literary form which came from the West, which we call novel, is not certainly an absolutely an alien literary form. Because what we call novel, in fact, similar kinds of things existed in India also. And mind you, It was 7th century. In 7th century, two very significant, quite sizable, you can say, books, which we can call novel in all major respects, in fact came into existence. One of them is Kadambari, that is the title of the work. It is written by the father and son called Banabhat and Bhushan Bhatt. Because Banabhat started it, but he could not complete, and then his son completed the novel. And it is Kadambari. And very surprisingly, in Marathi, novel itself is called Kadambari. The way in Gujarati we call Naval Katha, in Marathi they call Kadambari. Another equally significant work was by Subandhu called Vasavadatta. Later on, other writers wrote plays also on Vasavadatta, but Vasavadatta, the novel, is different. That also comes up in the 7th century. Banabhat writes in the first half of 7th century, and Subandhu writes in the second half of the 7th century. Both of them deal with social issues. Both of them are extensive works of prose. There was a feeling that prose as such came from outside. India had the traditions of writing in verses, and therefore even the essays, even the sciences were composed in versical form. But that is not true. It is not true because even in Vedic literature, that is even in the Vedas, there are many passages which are in prose. And in Vedanta, that is Upanishad, there is lot of things, more than half of the Vedanta is in prose. And therefore, prose was not an alien, you can say, style of writing in India, but somehow it has gone deep into our psyche that prose came from outside. No doubt, the people who did not accept the fact that India had anything called novel, what they argue is that even if India had prose writing, and that was not a sustained prose writing, there were passages or two, or page or two like this, but nobody had written, extensively as a single piece, something in prose. But that is not true because Kadambari runs in more than 700 pages, and Subandhu's Vasavadatta runs in almost 400 pages. Both of them deal with love stories. Both of them deal with the social issues. Both of them deal with the reality. No doubt this reality was primarily pertaining to the so-called royal class, the ruling class, because it is not the love story of common man. So there certainly they would differ from the English novels, where the central protagonists were common men, middle class people, which was not the case here. Plus, you have supernatural elements in both of them, and that may also give some kind of substance to those who say that it cannot be called a novel. However, if we take the definition as it exists in literary terms, then today every point which refers to novel has been rejected by novelists themselves. They are writing something which is not there in the definition. For example, novel was in prose, if I begin with the basic thing. But the students of Slovakia would be happy to know that in 1988, Mr. Vikram Shet was given the highest literary award in India for his novel, The Golden Gate. An entire Golden Gate is in versical form, and it has been acknowledged as a novel. He was given this award for writing a novel, and it was not in prose at all. These may be exceptional cases, but if you write in versical form, then still it can be called a novel. That is a fact. Earlier, novel was supposed to be a long narrative, but today we get novels which run hardly 100 pages. I'm going to talk of one novel which is only in 105 pages, and it is supposed to be one of the best novels by any Indian. So size is also not an issue. Thematic concerns. In the 18th century, when novel emerged in England, it focused on two things, money and matrimony. There was supposed to be some kind of love leading to marriage, or for the sake of marriage, love, or for the sake of love, marriage, whatever. And then it was also one of the tests on the part of the young man or the young boy, middle class young boy of England, to see to it that he marries and he does not lose money. He marries the best at the same time with maximum amount. Now, in both these works, in Subandhu's works and Manbhat's work, in fact, the entire focus is on love, which results into marriage. And they pass through very complex, very interesting struggles. And in these struggles, human beings are involved, family members are involved, society is involved, some rishis are involved who got upset and therefore they curse. And even supernatural elements are also involved. And both the lovers somehow cross all the hurdles and ultimately they come together and they marry, as it normally happens in the 18th century novels in England. So, love resulting into marriage is there. All kinds of difficulties are also there. What is not there is money. And money is not there. And for that, one can say cultural reasons may be responsible. That money has never become very important wherever emotions are concerned in India. And if somebody thinks of money where emotional issues are concerned, then he is a fool or he is lacking in basic wisdom. And therefore, being practical on the one hand and maintaining relationship at the cost of everything, these are two different things. And therefore, money is not at all important in these two works. And it has never become important till 21st century in Indian novels. Later on, career and then prosperity and money, all these things became important. So only there, it would differ. Further, in both these novels, they reveal a lot of social reality. It may be social issues, maybe ethical issues, moral issues, political issues, because they are princes. And so whom somebody would marry, whether somebody should allow them to marry or not. So all these things are there, which reveal the typical, you can say, monarchical reality of Indian society of 7th century. And so I don't emphatically say that they were novels. I don't say they cannot be novels. I leave it on all the erudite scholars of literature to decide. And somebody will have to, in fact, work extensively on these two works and then arrive at some kind of conclusion whether they are novels or not. Now, India is a very, very big country. Very big in the sense, geographically, and there are 22 official languages. And in all the 22 languages, we have very rich literary as well as critical traditions. The history of the literature is several centuries old, maybe not less than 2000 years. Or if there are certain languages which emerged recently, in fact, earlier they used to follow Sanskrit traditions, and then after, you can say, towards the end of the classical periods, 11th, 12th century onwards, in fact, regional languages started emerging. And then they have literature in the same thing, but the traditions continue. The issues continue. And so one can say that they are very, very old, if certainly not less than 1000 years old in all of them. Now, in all the 22 languages, literature is produced, and in all the 22 languages, novel happens to be one of the very, very important literary forms. Now, if there are so many languages, plus every language has so many writers, and then There are so many writers who are so creative, making experiments with the literary form. And therefore, in India, novel as a literary form has had, a very large variety, whether in terms of themes, in terms of form, in terms of style, and in terms of anything else that pertains to novel. And therefore, we have, a very large variety. And nobody can say that we have been following a certain typical literary form strictly. So Indian novelists do not completely follow the English model. They do not completely follow the Sanskrit model. Rather, they follow several things from A and several things from B. Plus, they also exchange with other Indian languages. And this is how Indian literary form has, in Indian novel has emerged in India. Now, I again begin with this thing that right now, whatever we'll discuss, the novel as such, in fact, that novel is certainly based on the English novel. The popular novel in India, be it in any language, even if somebody is writing in Sanskrit, in fact, most of them have been following the English model of novel. And therefore, the novel, as we are going to discuss now, has not much to do with either Kadambari or Vasavadatta. In fact, they have to do with Pamela, Joseph Andrews, and Lawrence Stern's works, and so on and so forth. So we can say that Indian novel is primarily based on English model. And in 1860, and the first Indian novel in English comes into existence. And this is by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rajmohan's wife. And Bankim Chandra Chatterjee has written only novel in English. Later on, he wrote many other novels, but all of them happen to be in his mother tongue called Bangla. But he did, in fact, master the literary form as it came from England and could reconstruct Indian reality so authentically, so movingly, that reading them, in fact, constructs the typical 19th century India in front of our eyes even today. And along with him, there were others in Bengal, because Bengal was first, in fact, to come in contact with the West. Because England, the East India Company had its headquarters in Kolkata. Later on, it shifted to Delhi. And therefore, Kolkata was exposed to English way of life, English literature, English language, and everything that came from England for the first time. And they were also the first to react against them in their own manner and assert themselves in the best possible manner. So Bengal happens to be, the territory of Renaissance, Indian Renaissance of the 19th century. So from there, in fact, it begins. And when it begins, then India was facing number of problems, and these problems were primarily the natural consequence of colonization. And if this colonization was there, then this colonization was preceded by another colonization of not less than 600 years. And that was Muslim invasion. Bengal, like Gujarat, also happened to be ruled for a very long time by the Mughals and other Muslim rulers. And therefore, Persian, Arabic, they also had their very powerful impact. Because of constant conflict, uncertainty, fear of getting liquidated, looted, uprooted. In fact, Indian society was plagued with number of social evils. And these writers, in fact, what they felt was that India cannot become independent if it doesn't become strong from within. And therefore, Renaissance brings reforms. And so reform was one of the major tools. And novel also used this literary form to bring about reforms in the society. Now, as far as the reforms were concerned, then there were two territories which were very, very prime. One was the caste system, because India was divided into castes. And the mutual relationship among this castes were not always good. And there was some kind of hierarchy. And this hierarchy was insulting, humiliating to the larger section of the caste. And therefore, caste system has to be removed. If India is to emerge strong, it must get rid of the caste system. And secondly, women, because women happen to be more than 50% of the population. And with women, the pride of the community is also attached. And therefore, the society had started feeling that women are in some sense burden. Because if something happens to them, then community feels insulted. And therefore, they want to carry out their duties regarding women as early as possible. And one important thing was marriage for girls. So the moment a girl is married, then the father is relieved from the burden. That had somehow got deeply rooted in Indian society. And so the attitude to women, getting rid of the responsibilities towards them, to make them get settled as early as possible, so that later on the responsibility lies with the husband. In fact, child marriages became very prominent. And child marriages led to all kinds of other evils. They were not only just social, but they also pertain to the life of the girls, who would become mothers at a very early age. And large number of them used to die also. And so child marriage, then no widow remarriage. On the other hand, polygamy was certainly practiced by some people. And so, if India was to be strong, then it has to see to it that equality prevails between men and women. And women are given another right to marry when they wish to marry. And therefore, the age has to be increased, that not before 16 or 17 or 18. They should get married when they are biologically fit for the marriage. And then, in case somebody became a widow, because at that time the diseases used to come, medical facilities were not very good, and therefore large number of people used to die also. So in case somebody becomes a widow at a very early age, and in many cases before going to the husband's house at all, then does it mean that her fate is sealed forever? And now she cannot enter marriage. And so during this period, number of Indian thinkers, reformers, who also happen to be writers, and some of them happen to be even novelists, what they did was they made use of novel to bring about a social change in the society. No doubt they were not didactic. That is what they maintained, because that had been the case with Indian literature right from the beginning, that you have to teach without the taught coming to know that he or she is being taught. So teaching was there, but teaching was always indirect. And so in this case, these writers, they started drawing the attention of the people to different types of social evils, different type of cultural evils, even political evils, and creating a kind of strength in the society to fight with the alien rule in such a manner that it doesn't become a victim to any other rule later on. The way in the 18th century, earlier we were ruled by Muslims. We got rid of them, but then we were ruled over by British, in certain cases by Dutch, in certain cases by French, in certain cases by Portuguese, because all of them had occupied different parts of India and ruled over it. And so, in this case, these writers, they started awakening India to all these things. What did they concern themselves with? They concern themselves, as I said in the beginning, primarily with the place of women in society, and also all the issues which pertain to her life. It may be her marriage, her love life, her married life, her widowhood, even the common challenges which every individual faces in the society. Then the caste system, then the education, the natural calamities which used to come very frequently, and a number of other emotional issues which individuals faced in the time. These emotional issues may be the conflict with the family, conflict with the community, conflict with the society at large, conflict with religion, conflict with one's own self, because individual may also be divided between his head and heart, or between his oneself and the other. And so all these things, in fact, came up in the novels in a beautiful manner. And so Indian readers or the lovers of literature, they got enriched, they got enlightened on what literature can do. And it started giving them a very, very realistic picture of the complexities of life, and also started preparing them to face the reality better, to face the reality successfully. And so it continued to go on. And this was primarily in the 19th century, just 40 years. But during these 40 years, Indian novel could establish its foundation. It built a very strong foundation, and with the help of that foundation, in fact, Indian literature, and in particular the novel, flourished like anything. By the time we reach the 20th century, in the early decades, in fact, there comes a major change in the stature and status of Indian literature, and in particular novels. What was it? It was the influence, and now not that of England, now not that of other parts of Europe, but now the influence was that of America, and also the influence was that of Russia. So Russian novels and American novels, in fact, they started influencing Indian novel to a very great extent, and in particular, the Russian novels of the 19th century. The writers like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Chekhov, Gogol, and many others. In fact, their works, they were quite popular in India. They came in different translations, or people who had learned Russian, in fact, they started providing their summaries, and in this way, India got exposed to the great classical literature, the great classics of Russian literature. And so we see the impact of Russian novels and also the impact of American novels on Indian novel in English. It is gradually becoming free from the British hegemony. It is coming out of the British influence, and they started exercising themselves in a different way like this. It was during this period that Indian novel gave three all-time great writers to the world. They happen to be Mulkraj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Rajarao. In Indian history, or the history of Indian writing in English, in fact, these three are called the three triumvirate, the three great writers of the first half of the 20th century. All the three are prolific writers. Prolific in the sense they're almost full-time writers, and the bulk of literature which they have produced is also of a very remarkable size. Thirdly, they were exposed, both Mulkraj Anand and Rajarao, they were exposed to the West. They studied, they worked in the Western countries, and they had experienced the Western life. And therefore, they had understood how they should communicate to them also. They wanted to communicate not simply with Indians, but they also wanted to communicate with Europeans. And so a new phenomenon begins. And this new phenomenon is addressing the European readership. Rajarao, for example, is making use of novels to construct the spiritual aspect of India to the European countries. He, for example, expanded the territories. That novel is not just social. Novel is just not political. It is not just cultural, but it can equally be spiritual. And therefore, in his works, Rajarao has explored to a great success, in fact, the spiritual aspect of India, which is a defining quality of India. India without spirituality is not at all India. Or one who doesn't understand the spiritual aspect of India cannot understand India at all, because that has gone deep to each and every corner of the country and to the last man of the society. So in his works, which deal with social life as such, but he picks up and creates an idiom which the West can also understand very easily. No doubt, on the other end, Mulkraj Anand, what he did was, he talked about the Indians who had come in close contact with Europe due to First World War, because two divisions of Indian army were sent to Europe to fight on behalf of England. And hardly out of 2 lakhs of soldiers, hardly a few returned. Most of them, in fact, died in the European soil. Many were taken as prisoners of war, and they died in different European jails. But Mulkraj Anand depicts lives of these soldiers. His novels like Across the Black Waters, The Village, and several others, they do deal with the cantonment life, the battlefield life, the new challenges of environment in Europe when the soldiers were there, what they wrote to their families in forms of letters and so on and so forth, their diaries, and such things are constructed. Now, Mulkraj Anand is primarily a socialist writer, and therefore is given to the ideology, Marxist ideology. And so when he portrays Indian reality, then his reality is filtered through his ideology. That reality is not social reality, but his reality is socialist reality. The way a socialist would look at the society and depict it. But he has observed very minutely and constructed all the major aspects of Indian life of his time. By that time, Mahatma Gandhi had also become an important factor in Indian political and social life. And so it was not possible for any great writer to ignore Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, in the history of Indian literatures, all the other regional languages, there is a period called Gandhi period or the Gandhi age, during which time in literature, Gandhi and his ideology, in fact, they play a major role. Rajarao also wrote a novel called Kanthapura. And that Kanthapura is in a way reconstructing the Indian freedom struggle, and in that struggle, the role played by Gandhi. And how? Because that is the early period And so Gandhiji was not absolutely successful. There were a number of other challenges to Gandhi. But he continues, he creates an environment to fight for certain principle. Whether you succeed or you don't succeed, but you don't sacrifice your principles. And that non-violence, non-cooperation, these kinds of things, satyagraha, insistence on truth, all these things, in fact, formed the major part, and it did make an appeal to the common villagers. So Kanthapura is a small village. And the people of this village, in fact, join Gandhi in his struggle for independence and fight with the British in the same spirit as it was communicated by Mahatma Gandhi. So that is their Kanthapura. And then others. Mulkraj Anand, what he does is, he creates like, English author, I forget the name, who created Wessex, isn't it? The Wessex country is created by him, and that Wessex stands for England. In the similar fashion, R.K. Narayan also constructed a region called Malgudi. There is no place called Malgudi. Malgudi is a small village, but here Malgudi symbolically, metaphorically stands for India. And in that village, it talks about different individuals. It talks about the different professions. It talks about their social conflicts. It talks about their domestic issues. It talks about their relationship with others outside. And all of them symbolically stand for India and its conflict with its own issues, as well as regarding its issues with others. And so that Malgudi became so immortal in Indian history, and symbolically he could capture all the major traits of India of that time. And this time is 1930s and 1940s, before the beginning of the Second World War. These three writers, in fact, continued. Rajarao, I'm keeping aside for some time because I want to discuss him separately towards the end, to discuss a different issue of Indian novel. So these three, and in addition to them, in fact, writers like Kamala Markandeya, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, Manik Bandyopadhyay, Bhabani Bhattacharya, G.V. Desani, Romesh Chandra Dutt, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar, Sir Jogendra Singh, Mr. Venkat Ramani, to name a few. These are some writers who wrote before India's independence. Kamala Markandeya, I uttered with an error, she occurs in the post-independence era. But all of them, they're dealing with India, its struggle for independence, its struggle for reforming the society, its faith on God, and its faith on itself. So that typical spirit is constructed in the works of all these writers. And in Second World War, which leads to some kind of laxity in the production of literature. But in 1947, the World War came to an end in 1945. And after 2 years, the British realized that it was not possible for them to rule over India anymore. And therefore, it was safer to make India free and retreat. And so in 1947, India was given independence. But this independence did not come with joy alone. It came with number of other problems. But before I go to number of other problems, I want to bring up another issue which was discussed in 1930s by Rajarao. but which had become very, very significant now. Because that was a dilemma on the part of every Indian writer in English, or it was a sort of dilemma for every novelist in English. Which were these dilemmas? The writers were facing some dilemmas, and this occurs in a very small foreword of 2 paragraphs in the novel, as I discussed just now, Kanthapura. In the foreword to the novel Kanthapura, Rajarao has written the dilemmas of Indian author, which I think I must bring to your notice. What does he say? He says, I quote, the telling hasn't been easy. Telling a story is not easy. Why? Because you're writing in English. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own. What you want to convey? You want to convey the spirit that is one's own. What you feel, what you assume, what you believe in, what you tend to practice. In fact, that forms your spirit. The spirit that you have, that spirit is not in a position to convey itself in the language which is an alien language, which is not your own language. He says, I go further, I quote, one has to convey the various shades and omissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. When you're writing in your own language for your own people, then many things you can take for granted. You can convey without uttering them, without writing them. But Rajarao felt that when he did the same thing with English, then wherever there was an omission, wherever there was a different kind of shade, then they happened to be misinterpreted. They failed to convey what they would have conveyed in their own language. And therefore, this was a big challenge. How to put the spirit of the characters whom we are portraying, because the life that you are describing is Indian life. And the characters use Indian environment. They use Indian language. They face Indian problems. And therefore, the spirit is Indian. How to convey the same thing in English, that was a major issue. Then he doesn't contradict, but he rather brings to our notice the complexity of the issue, the complexity of the problem on the part of the writers. He says that though we say English is an alien language, it is really not an alien language. This is not a contradiction, I must say. It is a complexity of the issue. He says English is not really an alien language to us. I quote, it is the language of our intellectual makeup. By 1930s and 40s, English had spread all over the country, and it is the elite class, the educated class, those who were privileged in the society, they had all undergone English education, and therefore their intellectual makeup had already become English. They had started thinking the way English used to think, or they could put their thoughts into English very easily, and they were good users of English. So English is not really an alien language to us. It is the language of our intellectual makeup, like Sanskrit and Persian was before. Before English came, Sanskrit was not our own language because we use Gujarati or Bengali or Marathi, but Sanskrit was the language of our intellectual makeup. And during the Muslim rule, Persian was the language of our intellectual makeup. In the same manner, now English was, the language of intellectual makeup. So how to convey the intellectual makeup, the thoughts, was not a problem. But it was not the language of our emotional makeup. Rajarao says that English had still not become the language of the emotional makeup of Indians. What Indians thought and felt, in fact, was very difficult to convey in English. Because thoughts are conveyed by all kinds of people, common men also. And naturally, they did not use English, and therefore, emotional makeup. The further says that we cannot write like the English. If Indians decide to write like English, they cannot write. And then later on, further he says, and we should not. If we continue to write in the same fashion in which English write, then what is the point? Then Indian literature will not have its identity as Indian literature. In which way it will become Indian? What is that Indianness? And how that Indianness can be captured in literature? And so he is presenting the dilemma, the complexity of the dilemma, further and further. Later on he says that we cannot write just only as Indians. Because that is also not fair. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. India always believed in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is, the entire globe is a single family. The entire earth is a single piece. And we are all interrelated. And therefore, how can I think only as an Indian? I have to think of entire humanity. And therefore, Indian writers in English must, expand, raise their platform in such a manner that they are able to communicate with others also. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. He gives a very good example that the Irish and Americans, they also use English. But even then, it is possible to find out that a certain literature is Irish literature, even though it is English. Certain literature is American literature, though the language is common. What has made them having the distinct quality is their spirit. There is Irishness in Irish literature, and there is Americanness in American literature. Rajarao was telling the writers of India that they have to use English in such a manner that one day that Indianness of English, in fact, emerges from their literature, and it is possible for them to find out or to realize that the literature in English is actually Indian literature. Problem?
Professor, we could hear you very well. We just lost.
Okay. So I continue. Even if the camera is stopped working for some reason. Later on, in the second paragraph, Rajarao arrives on the issue of style, the problem of style. So what will make Indian literature Indian? And therefore, we should have Indian style of writing. And so, are our writers themselves aware of Indian style of writing? Was there anything called Indian style of writing? And so he says, I quote, the tempo of Indian life must be infused into our English expression, even as the tempo of American or Irish life has gone into the making of theirs. That tempo has to come up. And so he reminds us that what was that? That was Indian. And he says, I again quote, we in India think quickly, we talk quickly, and when we move quickly. So that quickness, that fastness is something which is typically Indian. We have neither punctuation nor treacherous apps and ons to bother us. Sanskrit is a language which doesn't have sentence structures. Any word can be put anywhere in the sentence, the meaning remains the same. The way in English, subject has to come first and then verb and then object. There is pre-verbal and post-verbal position. In Sanskrit, it is not so. Any word can be put anywhere, sentence remains sentence. Secondly, Sanskrit does not have punctuation marks. In fact, while you read, you come to know that it is a question. While we utter or while we read, because in speech, punctuation marks are our emotions, intonations. They always get expressed. But when we write, how these intonations can be captured? But then there you have words which reveal that the intonation is X or Y or Z. Secondly, Sanskrit does not have prepositions like in, on, at, over. It doesn't have prepositions at all. And because of that, in fact, when we have to deal with these things in English, that you have to deal with structure, you have to deal with punctuation marks, you have to deal with you have to deal with prepositions, then it certainly bothers us. He says that we have to come out of it. We have to come out of it in the sense that let us follow English language, but let us rather follow the Indian style. And so what is that? He said episode follows episode. And when our thoughts stop, our breath stops and we move on to another thought. This was and still is the ordinary style of our storytelling. How Indians are supposed to or have been narrating the stories one episode after another, and there is a series of episodes and they come at one breath. He says, we also have to write in English in the same manner. And so, after independence, as I said, that it did not bring only joy, but independence also brought so many problems. And one biggest problem was the very partition of the country. India came to be divided into three parts. India, then the East Pakistan, which is Bangladesh today, and the West Pakistan, which is known as Pakistan today. And it was, a very sad event in immense size also. And this was perhaps the first ever in history, the migration of such a large population. You can imagine the scale of population migrating from one part of the country to another, that during this journey, during this migration, more than 1 million people came to be massacred by Hindus as well as Muslims. Because those who were on this part, in fact, they suffered, and those who were on the other part, they also suffered. On Indian part, we still had government to protect the minorities. But on the Pakistan side, in fact, there was no government to protect the minorities. And the result was more than 1 million people died, massacred brutally. And several other million, they became homeless. And they took more than 20 years to get settled. Families got dismembered and all kinds of things. In fact, Indian writers are responding to it. There is a very genre of Indian novel called partition novel. And there is a big number of novels which are written on the partition. This partition is written from Indian perspective, written from Muslim perspective of Indians, written from Hindu perspective, Sikh perspective, also Eastern Pakistan, Western Pakistan. Some are referring to the political repercussions, some to cultural, religious, linguistic, all these things. There are so many aspects of the partition of India. And different people believe different things to be responsible for the partition. So in this genre called partition novels, in fact, all the aspects of this mega event, sad event called Partition of India, in fact, are addressed and they are written. Later on, India had, 4 wars in the 20th century itself, or rather, I would say 5, of which 4 with Pakistan and 1 with China in 1962. But with Pakistan, right from 1948, then 1965, then 1971, and 1992. There were 4 big wars with Pakistan and 1 big China war. So this war affecting the life, because India has a very large border, and the people on the border, this border is in fact like European border. Several countries, in fact, merge into these 2-3 states. So big, and therefore their life is disturbed so much. And so Indian writers are talking about wars, talking about the philosophy of war, talking about the ways in which these wars can end. All kinds of things, in fact, come up in Indian novel. We have writers like Khushwant Singh, writers like Meera Kumar, writers, and there are so many writers, who have written about partition, and they've written about the wars later on. Another major event took place that was in the almost towards the end of the third quarter of the 20th century, and that was emergency. The Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, imposed emergency. And this emergency, people thought, would certainly, destroy India. They thought that India was not prepared for democracy, and therefore India will again return to, the typical old systems, medieval system of rule. But it was not so. The so-called common people all over the country, in fact, came up, and they struggled for 1.5 years, almost 18 months. Every major leader was in jail, and more than 2 lakhs of people were in jail. There was ban on media. There was every attempt made by the Prime Minister of India at that time, Indira Gandhi, to see to it that India succumbs to her power. But India did not. And finally, elections came. The emergency had to be withdrawn. Indira Gandhi was thrown out of power. And India again emerged a powerful democratic nation, because democracy, in fact, got further rooted. And number of writers, they have talked about the emergency and its aftermath, and also the emergency and the lessons, good lessons that people of India took. And if they took good lessons, then primarily for that our writers are also responsible, because they provide the perspective to look at these major challenges, socio-political challenges, in the right manner. Then later on came a big socio-religious movement in India, which also lasted for more than a decade. It is Ram Janmabhoomi Liberation, you can say, movement, which started, in fact, in 1992 or so, though it was going on since 1986. But in 1992, it entered a decisive moment when the movement spread all over the country, and that led to, even conflict also between 2 communities. And then this movement engaged, every village. For example, you would be surprised to know that to build a Ram temple in Ayodhya, every village, 6 villages of India, sent 2 bricks to Ayodhya. That these bricks would be of our village with their name. So when actual Ram temple comes into existence, these bricks should be used in the very construction of the temple. And that has been done also. The entire platform of the temple which is prepared, in fact, it has put all these bricks, more than 12 lakh bricks, which came from each and every village of India. So every village was engaged. It was more massive than even freedom struggle. Even freedom struggle did not touch many villages, but this movement touched each and every village. And then finally, the controversial structure, Babri structure was demolished. And now we have a huge Ram temple which has come up in Ayodhya. But this also brings into discussion number of issues which are not just religious. They are legal, they are democratic, they are human. And all of them are discussed in one way or the other by different Indian authors. And even some Bangladeshi authors have also discussed. Now, this demolition of the structure led to serial blasts, bomb blasts, again killing thousands of people in almost all the major cities of India. Mumbai being the main, you can say, victim of the bomb blasts. And that also, in fact, led India to a number of challenges. And again, Indian writers, and particularly novel writers, novelists, they're addressing this issue. And so, and there are a number of other issues which I don't think I would be bringing here. But all these issues, they're discussed by writers like Khushwant Singh, Manohar Malgonkar, Anita Desai, Geeta Mehta, Kamala Markandeya, Nayantara Sahgal, K.S. Dugal, P. Lal, K. Natwar Singh, B. Rajan, Arun Joshi, Ruskin Bond, Ruth Prawar Jabwala, Amitabh Ghosh, Upamanyu Chatterjee, Ellen Seeley, Shashi Tharoor, Suniti Namjoshi, Namita Gokhale, Farooq Dhonbi, Vikram Sheth, Bharati Mukherjee, Rohinton Mistry, etc. And still many other names can be added, but they have thrown light on all these major aspects which emerged in the post-independence, we can say, half of the 20th century. And they have reconstructed. Yeah. So, I'm moving towards the end. And this is how 20th century comes to an end. By the time we reach 21st century, then in 21st century, there is a new development in the field of Indian novel in English. The writers have started going back to Indian mythology, Indian ancient history, Indian literary texts of classical period like Ramayana and Mahabharata, and they have started dealing with these stories in a novel form in their novels. You have writers like Bharati Mukherjee, Arvind Adiga, Jhumpa Lahiri, Kiran Desai, Manju Kapoor, Chitra Banerjee, Divakaruni, Arundhati Roy. These people are not only dealing with some of the myths, but these people are also primarily focusing on the problems faced by Indians who stay outside India. Those who are NRIs, non-residential Indians. So in the 21st century, the Indian diaspora literature has emerged as a very powerful genre of Indian novel in English. And these writers have made India popular there. They have also made us aware of the problems faced by these Indians there. And they also reveal how Indians in these foreign countries want to be accepted by the natives there, and how Indians can contribute to these countries where they live. And as I said, that those who are dealing with mythology, then they are Amish Tripathi, Devdutt Patnaik, to some extent Chetan Bhagat, because these people, they are subverting. I must add here that most of them, though they deal with Indian mythology, they haven't been successful in dealing with this mythology in the right manner. But even then, they are popular. They are popular because they are subverting. There is a tendency in the 21st century that anyone who subverts, whether it is right or wrong, but just because he subverts, he becomes popular. That you are questioning, you are rejecting. And so these writers, on the one hand, they are not rejecting. On the other hand, they are treating that particular material in an absolutely new fashion, which is not going to match with the spirit of these mythologies. But they have become popular, and this may create a problem in the time to come, because if people are not reading the original myths as they are, it is possible that in future, these generations will see that whatever they read in these novels is in fact reality. Among this, the last point that I want to mention is that Rajarao is considered to be the one who could give truly Indian novels in English. And so he can be a model for those who want to create Indian spirit in Indian literature. Whether we take Kanthapura or The Serpent and the Rope or any other. In fact, all his novels, they are infused with, they are very rich in what is called Indian spirit. But among them, the Kate and Shakespeare happens to be more Indian than other novels of Raja Rao. More Indian because it is typically having all the complexities of Indian narrative art. For example, this is a novel which is hardly in 105 to 10 pages. Now, this novel was supposed to be, in fact, Rajarao expected his publisher to have 300 blank pages in the novel. That is 3/4. 100, they are printed pages, and it should have 300 blank pages. But no publisher did it, and therefore he was disappointed also. But what did he want to mean? That is important. He wanted that the readers, they are supposed to also realize what these 100 pages convey, but they haven't been printed on the pages. Second complexity is he calls this novel a metaphysical comedy, because something metaphysical is typically Indian. And I said in the beginning that the spiritual aspect of Indian life and Indian culture has been very well communicated or fictionally constructed by Rajarao. And therefore, he calls it a comedy, and it is a metaphysical comedy. And India did not have the traditions of tragedy. By comedy, what we mean was that everything ultimately ends happily. There is poetic justice in the end. The good prevails and the evil always loses. The typical, you can say philosophy that was very well practiced in Indian writing. And they did not care for what is called reality. The reality they would understand, and they would also strive to bring good reality in their actual life. And therefore he calls it metaphysical comedy. Because the protagonist, because all the protagonists of Rajarao, they have at least 2 marriages.
Professor, if I do not stop you, we will have no time for questions. May I very kindly ask you to conclude your talk so that we have some questions at the end. We have about 15 minutes only to the end of the talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So shall we open the question part? Yeah, so please, dear colleagues, dear students, feel free to ask anything. We heard a very, very interesting lecture, full of thoughts, full of ideas. I really liked the way how you, with great eloquence, described the development of the novel in India. And you also mentioned how the novel developed within its particular historical, political, and social context, which was for me very, very enlightening. So, dear colleagues, questions? Come closer.
There's one question in the chat.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. Okay. So, do the Malgudi villagers from the work you mentioned, where the village is an exploit of India as a whole, become a collective hero, all acting as one in, let's say, the climax of the story, or do they remain as individual characters representing the many sides of their society? That's a question from Emmanuel.
I'm not able to read.
Do the microphone.
To the Malgudi villagers from the word you mentioned, when read is an expire of India as a whole, become collective hero, all acting as one in, let's say, the clients of the story, or do they remain as individual characters representing many sides of the society?
Yeah. Thank you. In fact, Malgudi becomes symbolic India in the sense that that village represents any other village in India. And so whatever was happening in India, it was in its microcosm happening in Malgudi. So there are different characters who belong to different castes, different professions, different age groups. In fact, they symbolically represent Indians. And therefore, their problems are symbolically the problems of all Indians. For example, somebody's son is abroad and the parents are here or the father is here and he wants his son to come and take over the entire profession here. This is his problem. This represents the problem of everyone. India wants to be independent. People want to join Gandhi. How they would join? So there is somebody in the village, he does something, and it becomes the issue of the entire country. So Malgudi, in this way, faces all kinds of social, political, cultural, domestic, professional problems, challenges. And these challenges are not the challenges of just Malgudi, but they are the challenges in different degrees of the entire country. That is what, in fact, is implied.
Thank you a lot, Professor, for your answer. We have another question here, please, Peter.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. I'm somewhat a small fan of the Indian literature because one of my favorite books is actually The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it wrong, but it's a very beautiful book. And I just wanted to ask, do the authors in India get some acclaim for their work? Well, because, for example, this author, Arundhati, basically won the Pulitzer Prize a lot of years ago. But so she got a recollection or an acclaim for her work in the outside world. But do the authors in India get the acclaim inside of India?
Get exactly. Into Arundhati Roy and the God of Small Things. In fact, in that novel, she does discuss some of the issues pertaining to India. And, she could project that outside India as a typically Indian reality. But Arundhati Roy hasn't been responded so positively, so well in India. Rather, her presentation of Indian reality is being seen as ideologically colored. The issues are there, but the issues are exactly not in the same fashion, in the same shade in which she presents. And therefore, though she became very popular, but the overall perception in India, there can be exceptions to that also, is that the so-called high powers, I mean different powerful countries, in fact, what they do is they make somebody big so that their voice become bigger. And then through them, they speak what they want to speak. And so she becomes a mouthpiece of some such international powers who want to interfere with Asian countries and particularly India, because India may become a challenge for them. So that is how she has been perceived. And the novel is prescribed just because it got Booker Prize and so on and so forth. But people who read the novel, in fact, they haven't given such a very, I would say, a very warm response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question in the chat. Maybe from the audience on your side, someone can read it for you so that you can hear it properly.
Forward. I think better you read. I'm not able to read.
Can you tell us a bit about how the preface to Comparative discusses the challenges of translating Indian thought and language into English? I'm sure the same would apply to certain Slovakian novels translated into English.
In fact, this is forward to Kantapura. In fact, Rajarao, what he is drawing our attention to is that human life has two aspects: mental makeup, that is intellectual makeup, and emotional makeup. As far as intellectual makeup is concerned, it is not very difficult to convey. It is not very difficult, therefore, to even translate. But what is the emotional makeup, which represents your tempo, which represents your temperament, in fact, is not always easy to convey in an idiom which is not your own. And therefore, it becomes a big challenge. In fact, in translation studies, we call it cross-cultural translation. That whenever you have to translate across the culture, then as a translator, you face many difficulties. And all the difficulties cannot be solved. You will have to negotiate with the challenges. And different ways in which translators face this challenge, either you have to give footnote, you have to give you have to give a glossary, or you have to explain through some other example, or you have to come in a very near dynamic equivalence and so on and so forth. So this is the way in which you can do. What Rajarao has done, that without disturbing the English sentence structure, in fact, he has played with the sentence structures of English. What he has done is, he has picked up the different, we can say, units of meaning which Indians use when they communicate. And these units of meaning are not organized very strictly the way English grammar would permit. But there, he has been following the Indian linguistic practices to convey those units of meaning. And when you read this, even if you are accustomed to different kind of linguist system, in fact, the units of meaning will certainly convey the meaning very effectively. And if you are able to maintain the flow, then the meaning is not disturbed. The reader is able to understand what Rajarao wants to convey. So this challenge has to be taken in this way, that we need some dynamic, you can say, way in which we can face these challenges.
Thank you, Professor. We have one more question here, please.
I would like to also ask, what is the difference between the Eastern and Western humor for you especially? Like, for example, like, what is the difference in humor in India and in Europe in the literature? And if you could give an example of an Indian joke, that would be amazing.
Humor. Achha. In fact, humor is a very common phenomenon in Indian literature. No doubt, the humor would not be exactly as it is the case with Western literature. But the Indian writers in English, since they have been exposed to English variety of humor, then you find every variety of humor constructed in Indian novels. Persons like Khushwant Singh, for example, are very popular as far as humor is concerned. Even R.K. Narayan's humor is different. Mulk Raj Anand's humor is different. Khushwant Singh's humor is different. So this humor, in fact, is not in any way, I would say, very different from what you see in English novels.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Are there more questions, audience online or in our classroom?
Czy za rozumiałam genetyka?
All right. It seems that there are no more questions.
So I have one more question. It's me again. Hello. I just wanted to ask, in the 21st century, is there in the literature some part of authors who write about the LGBT community? Like, is it accepted in India, or at least in literature? And in what way would be my question.
21st century.
LGBT community in their themes.
Yeah. Yes, yes. In fact, there are a good number of writers which have started writing about LGBT also. No doubt in novels, there are not many, but writers like Rajarao, etc., they are quite popular. And yes, yeah, R. Rajarao, not Rajarao, huh? R. Rajarao is a professor of English, and he writes. But LGBT issues are discussed very frequently in media, and they come up in short fictions. They also come up in other literary forms. And so LGBT is not a big issue. It is quite accepted today. And I must tell you that in India, after every 4 years, there is a Kumbh. Recently, we had a grand Kumbh in Prayagraj. Now there are different kinds of religious heads. They are called Mahamandaleshwara. Now for LGBT also there is a Mahamandaleshwara. The religious field has also given recognition to LGBT in India, and therefore there can be a religious head who belongs to the LGBT group. That's all I think would be sufficient.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It will be time to finish because students will have other classes. So I would like to thank you for this wonderful talk, very inspiring. We heard about so many books. Now just to find time for reading, that would be ideal. So thank you once again for your willingness to be included in this series. And I do hope that we will hear you again in the future, Professor. Thank you a lot.
I also thank all of you again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So dear all, we are going to have a break of 30 minutes. The next lecture by Professor Zala will start at 9:30 of CET, Central European Time. So see you soon.